Hey, it's NPR's Book of the Day. I'm Andrew Limbong. Poetry is more of a kind of diagnosis than it is a calling. That's something said by one of our guests on the pod today, and he's kidding, I think, but maybe not. Because today we've got two discussions that are fundamentally about the type of person who can write poetry. In a bit, we'll hear from Michael Ondaatje, the author of the book The English Patient, who talks about amphibious writers, writers who can do both prose and poetry well. Think Raymond Carver or Louise Erdrich. But first, the guy who said that quote I opened with, Don Paterson, the acclaimed Scottish poet who's out with a memoir titled Toy Fights. And he talked to NPR Scott Simon about why a famous poet would write a book that doesn't mention poetry. That's ahead.
This message comes from Apple Card. You earn up to 3% daily cash on every purchase. That's 3% on products at Apple, 2% on all other Apple Card with Apple Pay purchases, and 1% on anything you buy with your titanium Apple Card or virtual card number. Visit apple.co/card calculator to see how much you can earn. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Subject to credit approval. Terms apply. This message comes from NPR sponsor Osea. Their Mega Moisture Duo features two of their clean, vegan bestsellers, Undaria Algae Body Oil and Undaria Collagen Body Lotion. Get 10% off your first order with code GLOW at OseaMalibu.com.
Don Paterson is one of the great poets in the world. He's the only poet to twice win the T.S. Eliot Prize and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. But he left school at the age of 16 to play guitar. There's scarcely any references to poetry in his childhood memoir of growing up in a working-class housing block in Dundee, Scotland during the 1970s. There are telling and hilarious recollections, like this about bedwetting.
Dad tried to incentivize my continence by putting a star on the door when I had a dry night, with the promise of reward once the door was full. This isn't a great system, but it works much better than battering the child into compliance or humiliating them before their peers. That I could manage myself. I recall sitting outside in the closed steps in front of the tenement with the bigger kids who were discussing what guns and outfits they were saving up for. I don't know what possessed me to breezily chip in with, if I don't wet the bed for another 6 weeks, I'm getting an action man. But the remark didn't quite win the nods of chin-stroking approval I'd hoped for.
Don Paterson's memoir is called Toy Fights, and he joins us now. Thank you so much for being with us.
That's a pleasure, Scott.
Tell us a little about that three-story building where you lived. You're right. There was so much more early death on the street than I took in at the time.
Yeah, it was fairly typical. I mean, I think because so much of the housing in Dundee was owned by the council and it was so homogenous, you didn't really notice anything, because there were no exceptions to it. But looking back, it was a very poor neighbourhood. But as a consequence of that, and the usual factors like intergenerational trauma and the experience of the men coming back from the war, and then the high levels of alcoholism, it would be true to say that life expectancy wasn't the highest in our street.
What drew you as a child, in Scotland after all, to the music of those American outlaws, Willie and Chris Christopherson?
It's interesting. I had to think about this, and I suppose it's, in a way, we saw it as what had initially happened in reverse, because, of course, Celtic music itself is a great kind of cultural input into country music. So it was just that music coming home again, but it was hugely popular in Scotland, so it wasn't unusual to be into it. But my father was a massive enthusiast. He started as a folk musician and then later became a country musician, and that was his love.
You write about a deeply religious period that you went through in your life.
Well, I sort of became a kind of Pentecostal Christian, and my reasons for doing so were kind of complicated. I think I was trying to square the circle of, on the one hand, pleasing my mother, but also kind of trying to be a worry to my parents as part of the kind of adolescent contract. So I found a way of sort of, as I say, squaring the circle by adopting a form of Christianity that was so extreme as to be quite a worry to them. So I went the full kind of charismatic Christian and spoke in tongues and all that stuff.
I want to get you to talk about what you very bluntly describe as, quote, my descent into madness. What happened to deliver you into Ward 89?
It was a hard thing to unpick because, again, it was a kind of odd convergence of circumstances, but one would have been recovering from that period of religious mania, but it was also drugs. I got heavily into, smoking too much dope, and at the time in Scotland, it was getting mixed with, other substances. So I had a kind of unfortunate out-of-body experience that was like a week-long panic attack, and after that, I was hospitalised for 4 months. It was diagnosed sort of afterwards, I discovered, as a schizophrenic episode. So that wasn't much fun.
Mm. You had, I gather, competing visions in your head.
I certainly had competing voices. I think the only thing that I took away was that there's nothing really at the center. You have to kind of create a self or construct an ego or something to hold to. Because for a while, all I had was various voices, none of whom I could identify as me. So the whole process was really sort of trying to kind of reconstruct a self just from available materials. So it was fairly horrific to watch it be dismantled in that way and realize that you didn't really have a center anymore.
Why is there almost no mention of poetry here in this memoir?
I think it's rather arbitrarily or maybe sensibly decided a cut-off point would be at the age of 20, but poetry wasn't any part of my life then, and it didn't really kick in until I was about 21. There is one little sort of incident that I remembered, though, from when I was about 6 years old, which was kind of odd if you're a determinist, and my father had found a little book in the loft, and I'd drawn a picture of Robert Burns as a statue of Robert Burns in the middle of Dundee City Centre.
Robert Burns, the great Scottish poet.
That's right. But I'd written underneath it, when I grow up, I am going to be a peot and write poetry. And that was the last I'd thought about it for the next 15 years.
All right. Just before our interview, the producer of this segment asked you a standard question to get your voice level that he asks. What was your first car? And you said you don't drive. And I said, huzzah, because neither do I.
Excellent.
And you write in this book, as a general rule, poets can't drive, and the ones who do drive shouldn't.
Yeah, I should qualify that. That's kind of male poets. I know a lot of really great female poets who also drive very well, but there's something about male poets and cars that don't go well together. I'm not entirely sure what that is. But I've often kind of suspected that poetry itself is really more of a kind of a diagnosis than a calling, and I think maybe an aspect of that diagnosis is that you also can't drive.
This memoir ends at the age of 20. Does that mean stay tuned?
Initially, it meant I didn't know whether I would continue or not, but I appear to have signed the contract and be 40,000 words into the next bit. So I guess so, yeah. It's a boyhood part 2, since men remain children until the age of 40.
40?
35.
I would give you beyond that. Don Paterson, his memoir, Toy Fights. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Scott. It's a pleasure.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Sony Pictures Classics, presenting Wicked Little Letters, a new comedy starring Olivia Colman and Jessie Buckley based on an outrageously true scandal. Wicked Little Letters is now playing in New York and Los Angeles, everywhere April 5th, only in theaters.
This message is brought to you by Apple Pay. Who wants to fuss with inserting a card into a reader, or worse, into a skimmer, where your card information can be stolen? Instead, pay the Apple way. Apple Pay is easy, secure, and built into iPhone. All you have to do is set it up. Just add a card in the Wallet app and you're good to go.
I've talked to enough writers who say, oh, I always had that ending in mind, and they sort of work backwards from there. But Michael Ondaatje says that way of thinking is completely counter to how poetry should work, that poetry should be an act of discovery. His new collection is called A Year of Last Things, and here he is talking about it with NPR's Scott Simon.
Michael Ondaatje, the Booker Prize-winning novelist, has a new volume of poetry, A Year of Last Things, and it may reveal much of his wide-ranging life from his childhood in Sri Lanka during World War II to his adolescence in London, his life in Canada, and travels all over the world. Let's ask him to read from the first poem in the book, Lock.
Reading the lines he loves, he slips them into a pocket. Wishes to die with his clothes full of torn free stanzas and the telephone numbers of his children in far cities. As if these were all we need and want, not the dog or silver bowl, not the brag of career or ownership. Unless they can be used, a bowl to beg with, a howl to send a friend, as those torn lines remind us how to recall. until we reach that horizon and drop, or rise like a canoe within a lock, to search the other half of the river, where you might see your friends as altered by this altitude as you.
Michael Ondaatje, author of The English Patient and so many other novels, joins us now from studios of the CBC in Toronto. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
What puts a poem into your mind?
I wish I knew, The main thing for me is that if you know where you're going, then that's not the way to go. Robert Creeley has a line, if you know what the last line of the book is, you take that line, you make it the first line. The writing of a poem is a sort of a discovery or a reconnaissance. You're not quite sure where you will end up. And I've always believed that's the central rule of writing, especially poetry. In a novel, you have large plots to contend with. But in a poem, it's all to do with language and a tone or a gesture.
Is this volume a kind of memoir? I'm thinking of the lines, all those small recalls of this and that before our walk up a staircase into the dark.
Well, I've never wanted to write a memoir, and I don't think this is in any way. It essentially was made up of individual poems that wasn't in the order they were written. So once I'd written all these 50, 60 poems, I then had to kind of find a shape or an order for them that would suggest something that happened at one time and then another time and how things changed.
May I ask, who is the person you write about in the poem Wanderer?
I have a friend named Sam Selecki who is Polish, and he's a good friend. But it really was not just about him. It was just as much about me as it is about his family and how they escaped Poland during the war.
I mean, it's quite a story that you relate in here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his family was helped by a German person and to escape Poland during the war.
By a deserter who,
yes,
I guess, acted as a father figure, or
he did, yeah, and he helped them get out of Europe at that crucial time.
May I ask you to read a short and what I found startling poem?
Mm-hmm.
Page 52, the Cabbagetown Pet Clinic. And yeah. Cabbagetown, the neighborhood in Toronto, right?
Right. For years I wrote during the day about the veterinarian, the howls, the heavy breathing, the sighs, from that faraway, untranslated world.
That untranslated world in which animals exist?
Yes, only animals. You could hear them, on the ground floor. There's a lot of it in the book about what is untranslated and what is translated. I mean, I think when I was writing the book, I had this sudden great love of poets from other countries. And, even great poets who, Zbigniew of Herbert, for instance, or Louise Erdrich in America. So I think what I was discovering at this time is that how much of the writers I liked were poets and novelists, as if they were amphibious. So someone like Raymond Carver, who is known mostly as a short story writer, in fact was a fantastic poet, or D.H. Lawrence, or Juan Gabriel Vasquez. And I became very interested in how they moved from one to another. And then I came across this great remark by Ivo Andrić, who's a Bosnian writer, who was a novelist and poet. And he said, poets, unlike other people, are loyal only in misfortune, and they abandon those who are doing well. And I just kind of love that aspect of this is the one quality in poets you can trust.
Oh, my. You write a lot about a dog and a cat in your life, too.
Yeah.
What did they call out to you? What is their untranslated world?
Well, I think there's a delight in animals that they are untranslated. So you interpret them in the best way you can. Anyone who has a dog or has lost a dog or a cat, there's an element of this great loss because it was unsaid, but you knew it was there.
Well, in your poem, November, I made note of these lines. You write very simply, "Oh, Jack, I miss your presence everywhere, in the corners of rooms, in every chair. I think it's one of your most extraordinary poems, and I don't detect any poetic technique in it at all.
No. I mean, it was, when we lost him, I think you were just left, you were made nonverbal, and you had to begin in a kind of different way to write or celebrate this cat.
You have lines that ask, boy, this gets at me, will I wear a bell like yours into the afterlife where language no longer exists?
Yeah, in some odd ways, it becomes one of the closest poems one writes, because it's not just recalling someone, but trying to reinterpret what was absent as well, or that was silent.
The book is called A Year of Last Things. Do you think about what's next?
No, I don't, actually. I mean, when I finish a book, I'm in a very empty landscape of possibility. I'd never really thought about what was next. And this jump from poetry to fiction to poetry to fiction, usually when I finished a book, I feel in some odd ways it's mortal, in a way. You can't go back and rewrite that book. So what tends to happen when I finish a novel that's taken me 4 or 5 years is I want to try and write something where I've never been before. And it could be poetry as opposed to fiction. So you're finding something new constantly to discover.
Michael Ondaatje, his new book of poems, A Year of Last Things. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
That's it for this week on NPR's Book of the Day. If you want more, you can sign up for our newsletter at npr.org/newsletter/books. I'm Andrew Limbaugh. The podcast is produced by Isabella Gomez Sarmiento and edited by Megan Sullivan. Our founding editor is Petra Mayer. The show elements for this week were produced and edited by Melissa Gray, Hiba Ahmad, William Troop, Elena Burnett, Ryan Banks, Shannon Rhodes, Ed McNulty, Samantha Balaban, Martin Patience, Matthew Sherman, and Danny Hensel. Beth Donovan is our managing editor. Thanks for listening.
Hey there, everybody, it's Peter Sagal. On our show, Wait, Don't Tell Me, it's usually just jokes. But a man cannot live on dad jokes alone. Sometimes you need to express your trauma that haunts you and drives you, as I did on a bonus episode just for Wait Plus supporters.
A deep dish pizza hurt me.
That's right, for a chance to hear the raw, real, revealing truth, sign up for Wait, Don't Tell Me Plus at plus.npr.org in order to feel my pain.
This message comes from NPR sponsor, the Capital One Venture X Card. Earn unlimited 2x miles on everything you buy. Plus, get access to a $300 annual credit for bookings through Capital One Travel. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. Details at CapitalOne.com.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Netflix, presenting Ripley. From Academy Award winner Steven Zaillian, this limited series stars Andrew Scott as Tom Ripley, a man weaving a complex life of deceit, fraud, and murder. Watch Ripley, premiering April 4th only on Netflix.